Ghosts of a Holy War is about the 1929 massacre in Hebron, in what was then British Mandate Palestine. And that massacre decimated one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities and also ended centuries of peaceful coexistence between Jews and Muslims in the city of Abraham, burial place of Abraham and the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. That massacre was caused by disinformation, misinformation, fear-mongering by the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. And what I learned over the course of my research was that the forces that led to that massacre and the forces that followed that massacre, denials and victim blaming, have continued throughout the last century of what remains a holy war. And those lessons have really been ignored for far too long. And so the book doesn't just focus on the massacre itself, but takes us from 1929 through today, illuminating just how long these forces have been allowed to continue and why those forces need to be put to an end.
Jill shared a little bit. I'm wondering if you can offer us a little bit more about how you came to write this story.
Yeah, so I woke up on New Year's Day 2019 to an email from Yossi Klein Halevi, who I had known and admired for years, but he wasn't my mentor yet. He wasn't even a friend. He had just known my work. And it had no subject line. It just said, I met this family with a treasure trove of letters in their attic, and I think it would make for a great book. Do you want to write it? Yes, but how do you write a book? And he proceeded to become my mentor. And before he introduced me to Jill, we met for hours in his office in Jerusalem, and he taught me, a little, gave me some tips on how I could go from being a journalist, because I was used to writing, long form articles, 2,000 words, 3,000 words. I had never, I dreamed of writing a book, but I had no idea where to start. And so he gave me the advice I needed to get started and introduced me to Jill. And my first time in Memphis was September 2019. I had just gotten married. So since I was first introduced to Jill, I've gotten married, become a mother, had 2 kids. And so this is kind of like my third baby. And I was in labor for a very long time. It was often excruciating. And Jill and I have both discovered on this visit that there were several times where both of us thought that I would give up. But after October 7th, I never had those doubts, and my feelings about how important this book is and my passion for writing it really intensified after October 7th, and we'll speak about that later, about how the book changed after that day.
So you came to Memphis. You first met them, you first read the letters. What was that experience like for you the first time that you were reading through this treasure trove?
Wow. Honestly, even after 5 years, I'm still just in awe of what a beautiful writer David Shainberg was, and also how wise he was. I mean, he was just 22 when he went to what was then Palestine. But even his diary from when he was 19, he wrote so eloquently, so poetically, and he was a writer. I mean, he wasn't working as a writer, but he was so talented and so wise beyond his years. And also what amazed me was learning for the first time in my life that Hebron was once this beacon of coexistence and peace. And I had not only never heard that, but I had never seen that. I mean, I had been, before I read these letters, I had been to Hebron just once in 2011, and it was a really depressing visit. This holy city feels a lot like a military base. There's checkpoints everywhere, and it's such a dangerous, volatile place where there are constant terror attacks there, and the fact that at the time it was, I think, 90 years since the massacre, that before the massacre it had just been this completely different, serene, beautiful place where Jews and Muslims lived side by side, not just side by side in peace, but also owned businesses together, drank coffee together, sat in each other's homes during holidays, went to each other's weddings and holiday celebrations. It was just really shocking to discover that from his letters. And then his letters brought me to read other testimonies from other people who had lived in Hebron before the massacre. And it was just a revelation. And I went from reading his letters, I then went on a journey to discover how Hebron went from this beacon of coexistence to the antithesis of coexistence. And I did hundreds of hours of reporting in Hebron, sitting down with Palestinians and Israelis there.
You went to Hebron again, right, after you had started the writing. Was that visit, how did that visit feel different after you had been engaged in all of this research than your first visit before any of this was on the table?
Yeah, so I went back for the first time in October of 2019, just a month after I had read the letters. And it was equally shocking because I met with Palestinians who either had never heard of the massacre or completely denied that it had ever occurred or blamed it on the British or on the Jews. And also I was really fascinated to realize that the memory of the massacre formed the bedrock of the identity of the Jews of Hebron, of the Jewish community in Hebron. They see themselves as kind of like the revival of this ancient Jewish community that was violently exiled, and they see themselves as living out their legacy. And in fact, the first settlers of Hebron, fought for years to revive the Jewish quarter that was destroyed in 1929, and finally they succeeded. And I had never known that. Probably a lot of us have read the descriptions of the settler community in Hebron as among the most radical of the settler movement, but it really helped me understand their way of thinking, to realize how much the memory of that massacre informed their everyday life. There's a legacy that they're carrying on. Yeah, and trauma that they are kind of reacting. They see themselves as kind of like avenging, instead of avenging it through, an attack, it's a vengeance of just existing there, a vengeance of here we are. And their presence itself. Yeah. So what did you learn about the massacre itself? So there had already been books written about this period in time, and they often had a few pages about the massacre, or even just one page. I went in and read all of the testimonies that I could get my hands on, testimonies that were collected from the survivors in the immediate days after the massacre, and also books that were written by survivors, including yeshiva students who had known David and studied with him. It was really horrifying. The details of the massacre itself, because I saw that there was such a lack of literature about it, I go into great detail about the massacre itself in the book. There's a whole chapter just, of the scenes, but it's gut-wrenching. It is. It was gut-wrenching to read those testimonies and to write it, and but I felt like I had a duty to tell those stories, because I think that's why so little had been written about it, because it's so horrific. But I think especially now in the wake of October 7th, I'm so glad I did, and that I didn't cut out those details, because it needs to be known. So the atrocities were very similar to what we saw on October 7th. Children were slaughtered in their mother's arms, babies, women were raped, men were castrated, some of them were burnt alive. Every synagogue in Hebron was destroyed and looted. And the numbers, 3,000 men participated in this massacre, which was a lot for those days. 3,000 Hamas fighters participated on October 7th, and the Palestinian population has multiplied by 10 since then. So 3,000 men participating in this in 1929 was represented. There were 20,000 Muslims living in Hebron at the time. 3,000 participated in the massacre. But I was one of the more uplifting elements of my research was learning about the dozen Muslim families who rescued their Jewish neighbors and risked their lives to hide them in their homes, and stood outside of their doors and said, you won't come in here. And one of them was stabbed for doing that. He survived. But one of my favorite details of that story was he literally arrived on a white horse to save the Jewish family that was renting a home from him, because at the time, almost all of the Jews who lived in Hebron rented their homes from Arab landlords. And it was often the landlords who saved their Jewish tenants. There were also landlords who tried to kill their Jewish tenants or succeeded in killing their Jewish tenants, but that was one of the most fascinating and more uplifting aspects of the research. And also what I learned about the massacre were, the forces that led to it, the lies that were being told about the Jewish community in Palestine, including this idea that the Jews were planning to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which sits atop the Temple Mount. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, he was the first leader of the Palestinian people, and he was the most powerful Arab leader in the country, and he started those rumors right around the time David Schoenberg arrived in Palestine in 1928. It was right around Yom Kippur when Jews brought a divider to separate the men and women praying at the Western Wall, and he seized on that, even though it had been done for years by Jews praying at the wall on Yom Kippur. He claimed that this was an effort to turn the Western Wall into a synagogue, and that from the Western Wall the Jews would then get Al-Aqsa and destroy Al-Aqsa to rebuild their temple. And this rumor that he spread just kept growing and taking on new life. And over the course of the year before the massacre, he managed to convince the masses, the Muslim masses of Palestine, that they had to defend Islam and defend Al-Aqsa from the Jews, and that's how the riots erupted. And it wasn't just that rumor, but actually the rumor that began a day before the massacre in Hebron, when the Muslim worshippers had left Al-Aqsa for afternoon prayers, went down and began to slaughter Jews at the Western Wall that day in Jerusalem. Rumors began to spread outside of Jerusalem that it was Jews who had slaughtered Muslims. And so not only were the Muslims in Hebron trying to defend Al-Aqsa, but they were also taking revenge against Jews for supposedly slaughtering Muslims when that hadn't happened. So really we see the level of disinformation that hasn't really changed, unfortunately, over the last century. We see so many of these this same propaganda being used to excuse the murder of Jews today.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit more in something that you said a little bit earlier in your kind of synopsis. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the role of fear and fear-mongering and how that contributed to the massacre and events that happened afterwards.
Yeah, so I spoke about Al-Aqsa and the disinformation that was used to whip up rage among the Muslim population then. It's no coincidence that Hamas named its attack on October 7th the Al-Aqsa flood. I mean, the power of disinformation and the power of Al-Aqsa has not faded. If anything, it's only grown stronger, more prevalent. I mean, Hamas's logo is Al-Aqsa in the background and a gun in front of it. I mean, there's a reason why these leaders use this rhetoric, because it works, sadly. And another parallel between Hamas and the Grand Mufti was that the Grand Mufti, the whole reason why he started this rumor was because he was facing accusations of corruption, nepotism, misappropriation of funds. He had used massive amounts of funds to build his homes. He was extremely wealthy, kind of like the leaders of Hamas who live outside of Gaza and whose people pay the price of their own incitement. And it was the same thing with the Grand Mufti. And again, it worked. The criticism against him began to disappear the more he made the problems of the Muslim population be not the fault of their leaders, but the fault of the Jewish minority that was just 20% of the population at the time. I mean, the population of Palestine in 1929 was less than 1 million people. Jews were less than 20% of the population. And it wasn't just the disinformation about Al-Aqsa, but he also paired that with fear-mongering against rising immigration. And the rhetoric he used was so much like the rhetoric we hear today from leaders around the world against immigrants. This wasn't, free Palestine. This was, these people are coming over here from Europe with ideals that are anathema to ours, because a lot of the Jewish immigrants who were coming were very liberal, egalitarian. Women were wearing shorts and short sleeves. The women living in Palestine, not just the Muslim women, but also like Sephardic women, were not allowed to show their bodies. One of the really interesting letters that David wrote when he first arrived in Hebron was how he was shocked to see ghosts walking around Hebron, because it was these women dressed in what he thought were sheets. So I mean, the rhetoric that the Mufti used against these Jewish immigrants worked because people saw these immigrants coming in with ideals that threatened their own, like threatening patriarchal society. And so the parallels are just, there are so many between 1929 and today. This is just a small sampling.
Wow. Well, we'll get there in a little bit about today and since October 7th. What were some of the most surprising elements for you in writing this book?
So what surprised me most was how little we know or how little we hear about the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, because he was, there's no underestimating how evil he was and corrupt he was, and also he was a Nazi accomplice. There's no debating that. He actually ended up fleeing Palestine in 1937 and made his way to Berlin, where he first met with Hitler and promised Muslim support for the Nazi cause. And he fulfilled that promise. And from 1941 to 1945, he lived in a Nazi-funded estate in Berlin. He was paid the equivalent of millions of dollars to become a mouthpiece for the Nazis throughout the Arab world. He was the leader of the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He recruited tens of thousands of Muslim fighters for the Nazi cause. And after World War II, he was actually wanted for Nazi war crimes. He was placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals. And yet he fled again and ended up in Egypt and then in Beirut. And unlike so many Nazis who fled and then lived their lives in anonymity and in hiding, he lived an open life. He was never prosecuted. And he went on in Egypt and then in Beirut to lead what would end up being the jihad against the Jews of Palestine that culminated in the War of 1948. And he founded what was called the Holy War Army, which is just one of the reasons why this book is called Ghosts of a Holy War, because there's so much proof throughout history that if you look at the protagonists waging this war, they see this as a holy war. This isn't a war over land or rights. It's a war of religion. And his Holy War Army was then joined by 5 Arab states, and he trained Yasser Arafat, who was his cousin. The levels of impact he had on current Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian nationalist movement are just really something to behold. And I still don't know how he's not more well known. But I think it's because if you look at his history, it really is a massive stain on the Palestinian nationalist movement that few people would like us to know about. It's one of many inconvenient truths that I discuss in the book.
Yeah, I was as you were talking, I was thinking there are so many of us that are educated about, the history of the region and that have read many books and taken courses. And he's clearly the most impactful leader around this massacre. And why is it that he's not a name that most of us know or know a lot about?
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because I was an international relations major in undergrad. And my focus was the Middle East, and I took dozens of courses on this conflict, on Islam, on the Middle East, and I don't think he ever came up or the roots of the Palestinian nationalist movement in lessons or in books I read. I don't remember him ever, at least not in that detail, and definitely not his Nazi connection. So I hope that changes.
It makes me worried about the other things that we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd love for you to share a little bit about thinking bigger picture impact and what impact the massacre in Hebron in 1929 had on the larger Jewish community and on Zionism pre-State of Israel.
Yeah, so before 1929, Zionism had not yet been embraced by the Jewish community of Palestine, nor by the American Jewish community or the diaspora. In terms of the diaspora, that changed after the Holocaust, but within Palestine, the Jewish community learned as a result of 1929 and the massive failure of the British to protect the Jews of Palestine. The opposition the Jews of Palestine had to Zionism before the massacre really just collapsed after the massacre, because the people who had opposed it were Orthodox Jews in Palestine, traditional Sephardic Jews in Palestine, who, like I said before, didn't really approve of the values of the secular Zionist movement. It wasn't Jewish enough. I mean, David Chainberg himself, in his letters, that was one of the most shocking things I found in his letters, was he despised the Zionist movement. He called it a vile anti-Jewish movement. And he was not alone. I mean, the Jews in Hebron, when Herzl died and there was a group of Zionists who wanted to have a memorial for him in Hebron, the Jewish leaders of Hebron were like, no, you don't. That won't happen here. And the Jews of Hebron were not Zionists. They were pious Jews living a quiet existence surrounding Torah and the Tomb of the Patriarchs. And that antagonism against Zionism, simply because it was secular, melted away, because they realized that if we want to live in our ancient homeland, we need to be under the protection of our own army and have sovereignty. Because the British really just failed miserably to protect the Jews of Palestine in 1929. I mean, they barely had an army. They had one British officer in Hebron. Of the 30-some policemen in Hebron, all but one of them were Arabs who either participated in the massacre or just looked on and allowed it to happen. And it was really a wake-up call for the Jewish community of the Old Yishuv, and the embrace of Zionism among the Jewish community in Palestine that began in 1929 as a direct result of the massacre.
I remember one of the things that you wrote in the book was about how when things were really getting heated, that the Jews of Hebron were offered protection.
Yes.
And they said, we don't need it, that's okay, we'll be fine.
Yeah, so 2 days before the massacre, a contingent of Haganah fighters, Haganah, if you know, was the predecessor of the IDF, they sent about a dozen members to Hebron in the middle of the night to speak with one of the leaders of the Jewish community. He was the head of the bank, and he was the only Jewish member of Hebron City Council. So he was considered a very, important member of Hebron's Jewish community. They went to his house in the middle of the night and said, "Let us stay here. There's riots are going to reach Hebron." The riots hadn't begun yet. They would only begin the next day in Jerusalem. But they had intelligence that they were going to erupt and they were going to reach Hebron, and they wanted to protect the Jewish community of Hebron by either having their members stationed there or giving them guns, or even they offered to just evacuate them to Jerusalem until the riots died down. And the Eliezer Slonim was the name of the man who they went to speak with. He was furious. He said, how dare you come here? I would ask for protection if I felt like I needed it. Our Arab neighbors are our friends. They'll never hurt us. If you guys are here, you're only going to cause trouble. And some of them left, but some of them tried going to other leaders of the community, and they were told the same thing. They said, you know, you'll only antagonize the Arabs of Hebron more, and they're our friends. You know, they've promised that they'll protect us, even if, you know, they didn't think that the riots would reach Hebron, because in previous outbursts of violence, none of them on the level of the massacre, but when there were other outbreaks of violence in Jerusalem, or there was one in Jaffa in 1921, they never reached Hebron because the relations were so friendly. And sadly, they were wrong, and it was too late. When they were told to leave, they left, and the Haganah went back to Jerusalem, and the only man with a gun, the only Jew in Hebron with a gun, was Eliezer Slonim, the man who had told them to leave his house. But he was actually killed despite having the most friends in the Arab community. His house was actually considered the safest place in Hebron, and when the riots erupted, more than 70 people took refuge in his home, thinking that the riots would never reach his home, that, you know, he had so many friends in the Arab community that they would never let anyone be harmed in his home. But on the morning of August 24th, 1929, his Arab friends said, you know, give us your foreigners, basically like the yeshiva students who had come, you know, from Europe or America, and you know, give us your foreigners, and we won't touch your family or the native Jews of Hebron. And he said, no, you know, there are no foreigners among us. We're all brothers and sisters here. And he was killed along with his wife and his 5-year-old son. Only their infant survived, and he was found in his mother's arms.
The reality of Israel is really different now. We have a state, we have an army. There's so much that they didn't have now that we do in terms of infrastructure. But your book also makes it really clear that some things have remained the same. I'm wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit and what some of those parallels are.
Yeah, so as I briefly mentioned before, the disinformation around Al-Aqsa and the use of propaganda by Hamas and other Arab leaders has not changed. And it was this disinformation and this fear and this propaganda that helped fuel October 7th. Like I said, it was called Al-Aqsa Flood. After the massacre of October 7th, Hamas leaders tried to encourage Arab Israelis, Arab citizens of Israel, to march to Al-Aqsa to open a new front in the war. Thankfully, they didn't listen. But they have used Al-Aqsa as a device. They've weaponized Al-Aqsa, they've weaponized Islam the same way the Grand Mufti did, because it has been wildly successful in distracting the Palestinian population and the wider Arab population from their own leaders' failures to alleviate the poverty that has been just pervasive in Palestinian society. And instead of actually trying to help their people live a better life, it's so much easier for them to just blame all their problems on whether it was the Jews of Palestine then or Israel today. And another parallel was the denial that followed the massacre of 1929. In the immediate days after the massacre, the Arab leaders of Palestine put out flyers, they put out articles in newspapers, they made statements to foreign journalists saying that there were no atrocities in Hebron, that Arabs didn't commit the massacre. So there was, on the one hand, this denial, yet also this victim blaming. So in addition to denying that there were atrocities, they also blamed the atrocities on the Jewish yeshiva students in Hebron. And there was this one statement that the Arab leadership put out called "Scandals of Jewish Propaganda." That was the title that was published in newspapers in Palestine and placed on in the public squares, and it said that the yeshiva students had carried out this massacre in order to raise funds from America for their yeshiva. And they even quoted the Jerusalem consul of the United States in saying that. And the next day, he put out a statement that was published throughout Palestine and in New York as well, saying, completely denying ever saying that. And what was interesting about the denials and the victim blaming that followed 1929 versus the same denials and victim blaming we saw on October 7th was that in 1929, newspapers like the New York Times and the Times of London portrayed those denials and victim blaming as lies. It was very clear to these journalists and these newspapers what were the facts and what were the lies. And yet today, you would think that 100 years later, the press would be better at its job. And yet today, those denials and victim blaming are given the same weight as actual facts. And these newspapers present all this information expecting that readers are just going to decide what's true and what's false, yet they've forgotten that their job is to tell their readers what's true and what's a lie. And here we are.
Yeah. So you're really touching on post-October 7th. How was the trajectory of writing this different? You'd been engaged in this for years, before October 7th. And so I'm curious, how did that change?
Yeah, it changed quite a lot. So I had been working on this book for 4 years before October 7th, and I was, I would say, 3/4 of the way through writing it when October 7th happened. And I couldn't function. I tried showing up at my computer, and I just couldn't write. It just didn't make sense anymore, because October 7th was a complete repeat of the massacre of 1929. And when I had been writing this book and reading those testimonies, I never fathomed for a second that anything remotely similar to what happened in 1929 would happen again. And it didn't just happen again, but on a scale far greater. And I mean, if 1929 changed the trajectory of this conflict and of Zionism and of the entire region, I mean, the earth shook on October 7th, and we still don't know how it's going to shape the region or us as a people. And so for I would say 2 or 3 months, I kind of struggled with how to continue writing the book, and I ended up doing a lot of reporting on the hostage crisis, and that reporting ended up becoming new chapters in the book. And so to make room for these new chapters about October 7th and the parallels between October 7th and 1929, I had to throw away entire chapters because the focus, the David and the family in Memphis is still very much a part of the book, but it was going to be much more about that and much more about how Hebron went from being this beacon of coexistence to what it is today. And so both of those elements are still very big parts of the book, but I think the overarching theme of the book really became, the parallels between 1929 and October 7th and what they tell us about how we got here and how we can find a way out.
Maybe you'll tell us. When you and I spoke a few weeks ago, one of the things that has replayed in my head over and over since then is your reiteration that it didn't have to be this way. And you said that over and over again in our conversation, and the way that this conflict has played out over the last 100 years was not a foregone conclusion. And I'm curious if you could describe some of the inflection points along that way where you see that arc of this conflict and our reality today, and where maybe things could have been different.
So I'll speak more about the history because that's really what I think can show us a way out. And in 1929, and even before 1929, the British elevated the Grand Mufti to his role as the most powerful leader in Arab society in Palestine. He was appointed to his role as Grand Mufti by the British, which then enabled him to become the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which was actually created by the British. By the way, the British official who placed him in that all-powerful position was actually a Jewish Zionist who thought that he could win over some of the Arab population to being more supportive of British rule in Palestine by elevating this man who was the most virulent anti-Zionist, anti-British voice in Arab society at the time. I mean, his rivals to that position were more popular than him. They won the election to the Grand Mufti. It's the position of Grand Mufti, but the British decided to pick him instead. And they were more cooperative with the British, more cooperative with the Jewish population of Palestine. And even after he became Grand Mufti and president of the Supreme Muslim Council, there were still Arab leaders like mayors in places like Jaffa and Nablus and Jericho and Haifa who wanted to cooperate with the Jewish populations, the Jewish communities of their cities, because that's what they saw was the future of Palestine. This cooperation and coexistence. And those people were intimidated and sometimes killed by the Mufti's henchmen because they disagreed with the Mufti or because they threatened his power. And, of course, we see that today with Hamas as well, how anyone deemed a collaborator with Israel, and that doesn't have to be people who are, giving intelligence to the Israelis. It's people who are just, seek peace with Israelis or have conversations with Israelis are intimidated or killed. So we see how that history hasn't changed, but also the way in which the British allowed his disinformation and his propaganda campaign to just spread like wildfire without doing anything about it. I mean, his campaign didn't just include this disinformation, it was also this effort to prevent Jews from going to the Western Wall by attacking them, by building a door leading from the Western Wall to Al-Aqsa, which made no sense at all because Muslims didn't pray at the Western Wall. But he was not prevented from doing any of this by the British officials who ruled Palestine and could have done something. Even before the riots, they were disarming villagers who were funneling into Jerusalem the day before the massacre, but the day the riots erupted in Jerusalem. And there was this British official who was taking away the swords and clubs that these villagers were carrying, and then there's this other British official who told him to stop doing that because it could cause, anger at the British. So there's this level of appeasement that's just one example of the appeasement that went on with, failing to disarm the Arabs who were attacking Jews, also failing to take any action against the British policemen who were, they were employed by the British, but they were Arab policemen, local policemen. None of them were prosecuted for taking part in the massacre. They all kept their jobs. They continued to be policemen in places like Hebron and Jerusalem, despite taking part in the massacre. And also in the aftermath of the massacre and the riots that year, the British sent this commission to Palestine to investigate the causes of the riots, which were pretty clear to anyone who was living in Palestine at the time, but they decided to investigate. And they concluded in March of 1930 that it wasn't the Mufti who caused the riots, it wasn't his incitement. They allowed him to keep his role, both of his roles. They blamed the massacre on a peaceful Jewish march to the Western Wall in which Jews protested against the British failure to protect Jewish worshippers at the wall. They said that had inflamed tensions and had led Arabs to carry out their riots. And the result of that commission's findings was then a new white paper that limited Jewish immigration, limited Jewish land purchases, and those limitations and restrictions carried on throughout the Holocaust. Thousands of Jews who tried to escape Eastern Europe and showed up on the shores of Palestine were interned in British camps in Cyprus and in Palestine. And the British ended up abandoning the Balfour Declaration that had promised a Jewish home, all because of this Arab pressure, which didn't help. The Arabs ended up carrying out this rebellion, a violent rebellion against the British, despite the British appeasing them in all of these ways. So I think there are a lot of lessons there for what we're seeing today in this effort to appease what cannot be appeased.
And there are a lot of moments, I think you're describing, where, especially pre-Shoah, it could have been different, and things didn't have to be the way that they ended up, both in Palestine, but also for worldwide Jewry. Obviously, we know what happened. One of those moments was in 1936, the Peel Commission that you write about in your book, and you describe it when British authorities met with Jewish leaders and Arab leaders in British Mandate Palestine, and they are kind of trying to figure out if they can achieve peace at that time. It seems like some of those arguments that were made during that time could have been made today. Can you detail, maybe even going into some of the book, some of those conversations for us?
Yeah, so I will actually read from the book here, because the words of Chaim Weizmann, who would go on to become the first president of Israel, but at the time was the leader of the World Zionist Organization, he testified before the Peel Commission, which was another British commission sent to Palestine to try to figure out the causes of what in 1936 was another Arab rebellion. And this time they didn't just want to figure out the causes, but also find a solution to the conflict between the Jews and Arabs of Palestine, and try to figure out if they could find a way to grant self-governance to the people of Palestine and get out, because the British wanted out already in 1936. It would take them another decade to get out, but they were already trying to figure out what they could do, and actually it was the Peel Commission in 1936 that came up with the first two-state solution that was presented in 1937. But it was these conversations with the Jewish leaders of Palestine and eventually the Arab leaders of Palestine, who at first boycotted it because of the Mufti. He refused to speak with them until he realized that by doing that, only the Jews would get their way, which was not really best for him. But before he agreed to speak with them, Chaim Weizmann had appeared before the commission 5 times, and this was in 1936. He says, in words that are chilling in retrospect, he explained that there were now in Europe 6 million people pent up in places where they are not wanted, and for whom the world is divided into places where they cannot live and places into which they may not enter. Those were his words in 1936, about 6 million Jews. The United States had for more than a decade closed its doors to Jews fleeing persecution in Europe. In Stalin's Russia, Judaism was effectively outlawed. The Jews needed a home. That home, Weizmann told the commissioners, was in the Jewish homeland. The Muslims had vast kingdoms in Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Transjordan, and Syria, on top of at least a dozen other states where Muslims were a majority, represented by a Muslim head of state. Could the Jews not have one small sliver of land to call their own in this world? He argued, the underlying cause is that we exist. The only question you have to answer is, have we a right to exist? If you answer that question positively, everything else flows from it. I feel that 100 years later, those words are still relevant as people debate the right of a Jewish state to exist. The revisionist leader Zev Jabotinsky, who was Chaim Weizmann's rival, had been banned by the British from entering Palestine in 1930, because he had delivered the harshest public condemnations of the British over their failure to protect Jews during the riots. But he was allowed to testify before the commission as well. And he said,